Hello, everyone. We are here today to talk about intimate partner violence or domestic violence in substance use treatment facilities. This is a very important lecture. In the state of California, certified drug and alcohol counselors are expected to be trained in domestic violence and trained to screen for domestic violence in substance use treatment facilities where it's very common. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I think before we get into our presentation today, I'd like to do an exercise. When I do this training in person, I have the participants in the classroom come up and read some statistics. It's an act called bearing witness. So to bear something is to endure something that is challenging or difficult, and to be witness is to see something. So what I'm going to do is recreate that exercise here. I am going to read a number of statistics related to intimate partner violence and domestic violence. This is often a very powerful exercise when it's done in person. The statistics are sobering, and in many cases, people may feel triggered. We know that many more people are survivors of intimate partner violence and domestic violence than most people realize. So if you feel like this is triggering you and is intolerable, you are welcome to stop the video. And if necessary, you can fast forward through this exercise until you see the slides starting to change when we begin the program. All right. I would encourage you just to sit back and listen. On average, 24 people per minute are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in the United States. This is more than 12 million women and men over the course of a year. 35% of women and 29% of men in the United States have experienced rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner. Nearly 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men ages 18 and older in the United States have been the victim of severe physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Nearly half of all women and men in the United States have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. From 1994 to 2010, about 4 in 5 victims of intimate partner violence were female. Over 75% of female victims of intimate partner violence were previously victimized by the same offender. Almost 20% of women in the United States experience rape during their lifetime. Nearly 1 in 10 women in the United States has been raped by an intimate partner in her lifetime. 81% of women and 35% of men who experienced rape, stalking, or physical violence by an intimate partner reported significant short or long-term impacts, such as post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and injury. More than half of female victims of rape reported being raped by an intimate partner, and 40% reported being raped by an acquaintance. Less than 10% of rapes were done by a stranger. For male victims of rape, more than half reported being raped by an acquaintance. 30% were raped by an intimate partner, and only 15% were raped by a stranger. 1 out of every 3 women and 1 out of 10 men have experienced unwanted sexual contact by any perpetrator. 1 in 6 women in the United States have experienced stalking victimization at some point in their lifetime in which they felt very fearful or believed that they or someone close to them would be harmed or killed. 2/3 of female victims of stalking were stalked by current or former intimate partners. 30 to 60% of perpetrators of intimate partner violence also abuse the children in the household. Among victims of child abuse, 40% report witnessing domestic violence in the home. One study in North America found that children who are exposed to violence in the home were 15 times more likely to be physically or sexually assaulted later in life. More than a quarter of the male victims of completed rape were first raped when they were 10 years old or younger. Most female victims of completed rape experienced their first rape before the age of 25. 43% of female victims of completed rape experienced their first completed rape before the age of 18. About 35% of women who were raped as minors were also raped later as adults. 1 in 10 high school students has experienced physical violence from a dating partner in the past year. Most female and male victims of rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner experience some form of intimate partner violence for the first time before 25 years of age. 43% of college women who are currently dating report experiencing violent and abusive dating behaviors, including physical, sexual, technological, or verbal abuse. Victims of digital abuse and harassment are 2 times as likely to be physically abused, 3 times as likely to be psychologically abused, and 5 times as likely to be sexually coerced. About 84% of victims of intimate partner violence are psychologically abused by their partners. Half are physically abused, and 1/3 of the victims of intimate partner violence experience sexual abuse. Nearly 33% of women killed in the United States workplaces between 2003 and 2008 were killed by a current or former intimate partner. 64% of respondents in a 2005 survey who identified themselves as victims of domestic violence indicated that their work was affected by the violence. More than half of the victims said they were distracted, almost half feared getting discovered, and 2 in 5 were afraid of their intimate partner's unexpected visit. Nearly 8 million days of paid work each year is lost due to domestic violence issues. This is the equivalent of more than 32,000 full-time jobs. These statistics were taken from the National Domestic Violence Hotline. You can find them there yourself. And I do this every semester, and every time I read those statistics, it still continues to astonish me. And it is awful in the truest sense of the word, full of awe. Those numbers are catastrophic. Intimate partner violence and domestic violence is the great unspoken national public health crisis of our time. The numbers are insane. Almost 1 out of every 3 men and women in the United States have experienced some variation of domestic violence. When you look around your work settings, when you look around a classroom, pick 3 people. Statistically, 1 out of those 3 people have experienced domestic violence. 20% of the women in this country will experience rape at some point in their life. And 1 out of every 10 women in this country will be raped by an intimate partner. They'll be raped by their husband or someone that they're currently dating. We are not able to look to law enforcement and the courts to take care of these issues. It is extraordinarily difficult to get rape prosecuted in the United States. It is almost impossible to prosecute rape when the rapist is your husband. Child abuse. 40% of children who are abused are in a household in which there's domestic violence. And these numbers are just insane. The number of people who are experiencing intimate partner violence and domestic violence are all around us, and yet no one talks about this. It is the great unspoken. And as we do our presentation today, I'm not going to be able to give you a solution to this challenge. This is an enormous challenge, perhaps the great challenge of our age. But I will tell you that working as a drug and alcohol counselor, you will absolutely be exposed to people who are survivors of intimate partner violence and domestic violence. Of the great numbers of people who have experienced domestic violence, a huge percentage of them end up in substance use treatment and or drugs and alcohol as part of the violence itself. Which is why in the state of California, you as drug and alcohol counselors are expected to be trained to be familiar with and recognize intimate partner violence and domestic violence when you come upon it. So let us begin. So what is intimate partner violence? Intimate partner violence is abuse or aggression that occurs in a close relationship. That's the blanket definition. An intimate partner can refer to current and former spouses or dating partners, but it also includes family members or others that a person may live with or have a close relationship with. Basically anybody that you've got more than a casual acquaintanceship with. If you have any kind of intimate relationship, and I mean intimate in the sense of closeness, not intimate in the sense of sexual. If you have an intimate relationship, that person is considered an intimate partner. So intimate partner violence can range from one episode of violence that could have a lasting impact to chronic and severe episodes over multiple years. Now, you may have noticed that I'm using intimate partner violence and domestic violence at the same time. So they're considered mostly synonymous. For the most part, the phrase intimate partner violence is the preferred phrasing. It's the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, now refers to domestic violence as intimate partner violence. I've heard some distinctions out there where people use intimate partner violence if it's a romantic partner, they use domestic violence if it's in the home, but there's no real agreed upon version of this. So for the purposes of this presentation, intimate partner violence and domestic violence mean the exact same thing. So intimate partner violence or domestic violence is typically defined as a cycle of violence, and I put that in quotes to say that it includes the intentional verbal, physical, sexual, or psychological abuse that is done from one person to another in order to control them. In the public eye, violence is typically associated with physical violence. And about half of people who experience intimate partner violence do experience physical violence. But it's important to recognize that violence can also include verbal and psychological interactions. The long-lasting damage that happens from experiencing verbal and psychological abuse in many cases lasts longer and is more incapacitating than physical injuries that happen from partner violence. So the idea here that's also important is that it needs to be intentional and it is done to control another person. So in any long relationship, there may be an incident in which somebody loses control of themselves or loses control of their temper and lashes out at another person. They throw something at another person, or they may even shove another person, or they say something that's hurtful. That would not be considered intimate partner violence or domestic violence. In incidences like that, it's certainly poor communication skills and needs to be addressed. But what we are most concerned about is a pattern or a cycle of violence that's done with the intent to try and control the other person. In essence, intimate partner violence serves to imprison or hold the victim captive by taking away personal freedom and choice. And they take away that personal freedom and choice because it becomes very difficult to express self-efficacy and willpower due to the negative consequences or the violence that would happen if the person attempted to do that. So the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, defines 4 types of intimate partner violence or behavior. So physical violence is when someone tries to hurt somebody else by hitting, kicking, pushing, holding, or using any type of physical force. So sexual violence is forcing or attempting to force a partner to take part in a sex act, or forcing sexual touching, or even a non-physical sexual event like sexting. So if someone is forcing somebody else to take naked pictures of themselves and send it to them, over the internet or a cell phone, that's considered sexting. So if it is done without the person's consent, or the person feels like they cannot consent, then that is considered sexual violence. Stalking is a pattern of repeated unwanted attention and contact by a partner that causes fear or concern for one's own safety or the safety of someone close to the victim. So somebody who is watching someone else outside of work, somebody who's leaving threatening phone calls, those are all considered acts of stalking. And psychological aggression is the use of verbal and nonverbal in communication with the intent to harm the other person mentally or emotionally and to exert control over them. So this could be using fear and intimidation. This could also be using more emotional abuse by tearing a person down and assaulting their self-esteem in order to try and control them. So I've used the word victim and survivor. Just a quick side note here. In general, persons who are currently being abused by an intimate partner are referred to as victims. Persons who have left or escaped an intimate partner or intimate partner violence are referred to as survivors. This is another one where there is no set definition, but in general practice, victims mean they're currently in it, survivors mean that they've managed to get out of that. In my own practice, when working with people with substance use disorders, if they are in some kind of an inpatient or residential treatment facility where they're not currently interacting with an intimate partner, I will tend to refer to them as survivors. It's a good strength-based perspective to help people see themselves as survivors whenever possible, rather than somebody who's currently a victim. So the cycle of intimate partner violence has been well established. It doesn't necessarily happen all of the time. If you go down and we look at this kind of starting here with the honeymoon phase. So the honeymoon phase, say in a relationship when people first get together, there's no violence. And what happens then is there's some sort of tension building period where there might be minor incidents of physical or emotional abuse, or attempts to control the situation, and then the tension leads to the explosion, whatever the actual act of violence is. Typically, what we found then is the perpetrator will go back to the honeymoon phase and say, I'm sorry, that shouldn't have happened, it won't happen again, but there's usually an implicit threat that's in there. I told you you shouldn't make me angry like that. I warned you something like that, might happen. Well, babe, it was just because I was drinking. I'm sorry. And then what happens is it starts again. From the honeymoon phase, it goes back to the tension building, back to the explosion, back to the honeymoon. So the idea here in this cycle of violence is that denial is what's allowing the cycle to continue. And it is denial both on the part of the perpetrator and it is denial on the part of the victim. And in many cases, when we're talking about the great unspoken public health crisis, there's denial from society at large that this violence is happening, which allows it to continue. These are a couple of old charts, but I think they're still useful. The intimate partner violence wheel, or the domestic violence wheel, gives you some examples of what violence looks like. It can be really helpful for people to understand that violence isn't just physical violence, that using words or coercion or threats, withholding money from economic abuse, things like that, are also aspects of abuse. If you like, you can pause the recording and spend some time reading that. wheel there to see some additional ways that people can abuse each other. And then the nonviolence wheel came out as a response to the violence wheel as examples of how to have equality in a relationship that doesn't entail violence. So the violence wheel and the nonviolence wheel are often used in psychoeducational groups and counseling settings to help people understand the difference between the two. So the big question that everybody always has is, why do victims stay in a violent situation or a violent relationship? Generally, when I'm doing this live with people in front of me, we have a discussion where people volunteer answers as to why people stay. And there are many, but the first and most important one is fear. People stay in those situations because they're afraid. And there are often very complicated factors like economic dependence. If someone is psychologically abusing somebody else by telling them money, you don't need money. What do you need money for? You just stay home and raise the kids. I'm the one that works here. If you need money, you come to me. I'll give you money for grocery shopping, things like that. That creates a tremendously powerful economic dependence where it can be terrifying to think of leaving the situation because you have no money. Many times people are feeling isolated or a lack of support. They don't know where to go. They don't know who to talk to. They have low self-esteem. They've been attacked so many times that they feel like there is no other option than this. There's many times built-in cultural assumptions. I've personally heard this myself in my practice, where people who are in intimate partner or domestic violence situations say things like, well, I don't want to leave him because the children really need a father. That, by the way, is a total crock. Statistically, and research shows us that children in a situation in which they are witnessing domestic violence are much worse off than children who are raised by a single parent where there is no violence, or somebody who's lost an intimate partner, left an intimate partner violence situation. Many cases, religion prohibits divorce or leaving a relationship till death do us part and all of that. There's many times there's social and family pressures to stay in a situation. Someone may go and talk to their own mother or their parent about the intimate partner violence, and they may get a response like, well, honey, I'm sorry to hear that, but until death do us part, you two are married. Have you thought about doing counseling? Counseling, by the way, is contraindicated when somebody is currently in a domestic violence situation, because in many times the violence can get worse while somebody is in a counseling setting. And then there's the emotional ties. People are very ambivalent about their abusers. Many times they do feel love and care and affection for the person who's abusing them, and those emotional ties can cause people to stay as well. So the most important thing is to recognize that there is always a reason why the person's staying in an intimate partner violence situation. Always. And for them, it's going to be a good reason. Maybe not good from our perspective, but something that makes them feel like it's going to be more difficult to leave the situation than to just stay in it. So these physical safety, economic, emotional, and psychological reasons why a person stays in a terrible situation are very powerful. And so most victims turn the, well, why don't you just leave question upon themselves? And they experience lots of shame and guilt and despair. So it's very important as a clinician that we don't ask like, well, why don't you just get out of that situation? Instead, we want to make sure that we recognize that they're staying in that situation for some reason. And what we need to do is to try and join with them and understand what's going on and see if we can help. So intimate partner violence and substance use, or why are you being taught about intimate partner violence as trainee drug and alcohol counselors, is because these two intertwine all the time. So we talked in the very beginning in our exercise about how common intimate partner violence is. Again, 1 out of every 3 men and women have experienced at least one incident of violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 32% of women, 28% of men have experienced physical violence from an intimate partner. That one about men actually is really important too to recognize. There's kind of a belief out there that men can't be physically abused by their partner, which is absolutely wrong. Men experience physical violence from partners, both female and male, in their relationships. And it's important that we're aware that this happens as well. And again, of both attempted and completed rapes, 47%, or almost half the time, it's a current or former intimate partner. So while intimate partner violence is more common among the general population than widely known, among people who abuse substances, the frequency of intimate partner violence is astonishingly high. So substance use is involved in as many as 92% of reported incidences or episodes of intimate partner violence, either by the victim or the perpetrator. So some research studies related to this: 67 to 93% of men who abuse their intimate partners have an alcohol use disorder. In one study that was done by the VA, all male veterans who were in treatment at the VA for an alcohol use disorder, 20 to 33% of them reported having assaulted or abused their spouses in the past year. So, essentially we're looking at somewhere between, a third to a fifth of all the male veterans who are in treatment are also perpetrators of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Some arrest records: over 50% of people who are arrested for intimate partner violence have alcohol in their system during the time of the arrest. 72%, so 3 out of every 4 people who are arrested for intimate partner violence either have alcohol and or other drugs in their system. And women who are injured by an intimate partner are 2 to 3 times more likely to abuse alcohol than the general population. So the bottom line here is that substance abuse and intimate partner violence commonly co-occur, meaning they're happening at the same time. So SAMHSA, the Federal Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration's Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, and the state of California, who adopted SAMHSA's requirements, they've made it a requirement that alcohol and drug counselors are familiar with intimate partner violence and trained to screen clients for its potential presence. The idea here is that intimate partner violence should be an expectation, not an exception, among clients in substance use treatment. That's a very important frame of reference. If it is an expectation, it means you assume everybody has been either a victim or a perpetrator of intimate partner violence if they're in your substance use treatment facility, versus assuming that nobody has experienced intimate partner violence unless otherwise identified. So if you assume that everybody's done it, then you treat for it right out of the gate. We know that undiagnosed intimate partner violence or domestic violence interferes with treatment effectiveness and contributes to relapse. The outcomes for people who are in an intimate partner violence situation are much poorer compared to people who are not. We have talked in the family counseling class about how important it is to involve the family in relapse prevention planning, but involving the family, if the family are also your abusers, would obviously be contraindicated and potentially contribute to relapse. So the idea here is that all substance use treatment facilities should be screening, and in California will be screening, for current and past intimate partner violence, including childhood physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, including statutory rape. We'll talk more about that as we go through. So it's important that we recognize that any physical, emotional, or psychological indicator could be a result of intimate partner violence, meaning that if somebody is in your treatment facility and they show up with a black eye, right, that could be a result of intimate partner violence. If someone breaks down in tears while they're in a group counseling setting and somebody is talking about abuse at the hands of their former spouse, that emotional reaction could be a result of the fact that they have also experienced intimate partner violence. Or psychological indicators, somebody who is chronically depressed could also be a result of domestic or intimate partner violence. So as a drug and alcohol counselor, it is your responsibility to ask and address, is there potential intimate partner violence that's a contributing factor? So the purpose of doing an intimate partner violence screening is to determine if there might be intimate partner violence in the client's current or past relationships, including family members. So again, I want to highlight the word might. So when we are doing a screening, we do not need to definitively prove that there is intimate partner violence. What we are trying to do is answer the question, is there any evidence that intimate partner violence is possible in my clients' relationships. So let's go back to somebody who shows up with a black eye in your trauma group, and they burst into tears when somebody is talking about their ex-husband abusing them, and you do a screening. So you follow up with that person and you ask them what's going on. You say, I noticed that you were really triggered today in group, and I'm noticing that you came in with a black eye. I'm wondering if something is happening at home, and you might also be experiencing some kind of violence. Now, if the person says, no, nothing like that, there's nothing going on at home, you still have evidence that there might be something that's happening that could indicate intimate partner violence, because you can point to both the physical representation of that and the emotional representation. So the goal of a screening is simply to determine if it might be a possibility. So if the screening indicates that there might be intimate partner violence in the relationship or the family system, then the next step is going to try to be to connect the client with somebody who is fully trained or more trained in intimate partner and DV assessment. So essentially it kind of starts here. You do the screening, and is there any indication that intimate partner violence is possible? If the answer is no, right, then we're done. But if there is some indication that it might be possible, then we're going to refer that person for additional assessment. I'll talk more about that later in this presentation. So when you're doing a screening, you are essentially doing an assessment, like any clinical assessment. So when you're doing an assessment, it's going to require gathering information. And you're going to do that by asking targeted questions and by observing people's responses. So when you're doing a screening, you're not going to waste time by saying like, wow, how do you feel about the weather lately? Gee, like, what's your thoughts about baseball season this year? Right? Those are not targeted questions. So when you're doing a screening, you are going to directly go at questions to try and get an answer of whether intimate partner violence is possible. And you're going to observe responses. So again, we just simply need evidence that it might be possible. So if you're asking questions and the person is saying no to all of your questions, but they're looking around and they're showing evidence of being really uncomfortable and they're starting to have an anxiety attack, well, that observation would suggest that yes, this might be the case no matter what the client might be saying. So doing any kind of assessment, it is critical to establish a therapeutic rapport, meaning you've got to form a relationship or join with the client. This is always important in doing any kind of an assessment. It is particularly important when you're doing any kind of domestic violence or intimate partner violence screenings, because most clients who are victims or survivors of intimate partner violence do not want to talk about it. This is something that they may be holding because of guilt and shame factors. They might not want to talk about it because of fear factors. There's lots of reasons why people wouldn't want to talk about it. And so in doing this screening, your job is to be direct and matter of fact so that you can get the answers that you need while making sure you understand that you may be interviewing a trauma survivor. There are some other lessons that you will learn about trauma-informed care and how to be with somebody who's a potential trauma survivor. In the way that you ask things, you don't want to potentially re-traumatize the person. However, part of trauma-informed care is asking direct and matter-of-fact questions so that you can also identify any potential trauma incidences. So the idea here is that showing genuine care and concern along with empathetic understanding is critical when you're screening somebody for intimate partner violence to try and encourage them to talk about it and reveal their situation. So I think it's also significant to recognize that in many cases, alcohol and drug counselors are the first person that a client confides in and reveals intimate partner violence. There many times victims and survivors of intimate partner violence are really ambivalent about their abusers, or they may be codependent with their abusers. They don't want to talk about it. And so it's important that we express empathy and care and concern and understanding and respect for the fact that they're talking about something that's very challenging for them. And we have an ethical responsibility to respond in a way that's supportive and understanding and resourceful, hopefully ultimately helpful. So let's talk about the screening interview. So when you're doing an intimate partner or domestic violence screening, there are both formal screenings and informal screenings. So most agencies do a formal screening on intake, and then they do informal screenings as needed or indicated. So a formal screening is a standardized questionnaire with interview questions about intimate partner violence experiences. So it'll literally look like a piece of paper that has a set number of questions, and you are supposed to ask the client all of those questions. All of the treatment facilities in San Diego that I'm aware of, definitely the ones that are licensed and certified by the state, have some kind of standard questionnaire. And almost all of them include that as part of an intake, where they ask, have you ever been involved in a relationship in which there was some kind of abuse? Have you ever been in a domestic violence situation, et cetera? Then informal screenings are done mostly on the fly, as indicated. So an informal screening means you're not looking at a sheet of paper with standardized questions. What you're going to do is ask appropriate questions based upon something that you've seen or heard. So a client, again, going back to our group situation, a client who bursts into tears when hearing somebody else talk about domestic violence, we may do an informal screening after that group, or should do an informal screening after that group, to ask them questions about their reaction and if they're experiencing the same thing. Sometimes, especially in residential programs, you may overhear conversations or overhear a comment as you're walking by. And so you're going to want to clarify and confirm what you heard and ask if they're experiencing this also. And following up observations you may see, the client in the milieu or out there in the environment. So most of the time, formal screenings done upon intake or as part of a formal intake process. Informal screenings done on the fly as needed when somebody says something that indicates that this might be something they're experiencing. So some agencies have their own intimate partner violence or domestic violence formal screening questions. Some others will use a standardized form, which is usually funder related. So depending upon how your program gets funding, they may have a form that they're required to use by the funder. So whatever it is that they have, you're just going to use that. If in rare occasions you didn't have a formal questionnaire, the Tip 25 book in your text includes some common screening forms in the appendix that you definitely can use. And then I've also provided you with the American Medical Association domestic violence screening questions here. So let's go check that out. So on Canvas, in the Files section over here, when you click on Files, it'll take you to a series of folders, and one of these folders is Handouts. And in the Handouts folder, you'll see a folder on domestic violence screening. So when you click on that folder there, the domestic violence AMA screening questions are here. So in a classroom setting, what we do is we go through this. Each of you would be doing a domestic violence screening with somebody playing the role of a client so that you can get used to asking these questions here. But you can see the standard questions that are being direct in asking about intimate partner violence. So are you in a romantic or domestic relationship or have been in a relationship? We all fight with our partners at some point. What happens when you and your partner fight? Have you ever felt you were treated badly? Has your partner used drugs and alcohol? Are they ever verbally or physically abusive when intoxicated? Have they ever prevented you from leaving the house, seeing your family and friends, etc.? So you can look over this, and I encourage you to do so on your own. And unfortunately, again, this is something that normally we would be going over in detail in the classroom setting. So going back to our presentation then, there are many different variations of screening tools that are out there. So it's important to recognize that many victims or survivors will deny interpersonal intimate partner violence during an initial formal screening, even if the perpetrator is not in the facility with them. Most people, when they come into treatment, they're very cautious. They don't know you or the treatment agency. They don't know if they can trust you yet. So asking them right out of the gate, you'll get a lot of nope, nope, not happening here, nope. Even though we know statistically, I mean, just in the general public, 1 out of every 3 people have experienced some form of intimate partner violence. And again, those stats are much higher in treatment. So we therefore need to be alert to any indicators that may happen over time as the person becomes more comfortable with us or in the treatment setting. And then we need to conduct additional informal screenings as that new information comes up. So a couple of things about setting the stage for doing a screening. So the screening itself, you'll use the formal questionnaire, or you're just going to ask informal questions related to what you're saying. But there's a couple of things you always want to take into consideration. So one is you always interview the person in private, even if they request the presence of another person. It is not uncommon for perpetrators to manipulate friends and family members to relay information they heard in the interview that could put the client at risk. We had this experience once where I was working in a residential program where it was a homeless treatment facility, and the woman was deaf, and her husband was her interpreter. Her husband spoke in sign language. And we had a number of indications that suggested that there might be intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And in this program, everybody had to go through some kind of a screening and assessment. And the woman insisted that her husband had to be there in order to interpret. And we told her, no, we will provide an interpreter for you. And of course, the husband is the one that's relaying this information to us, saying, no, she insists, I have to be in there. I'm the one she's comfortable with. And it ultimately, we had a standoff where we said, I'm sorry, but by policy, we always do our assessments with individuals in private. And it went all the way to where they were about to have to leave our program until the woman finally agreed to meet with an interpreter and do the assessment. And then, of course, it turned out there was actually intimate partner violence. Now, you can certainly imagine that if the perpetrator, the person who was abusing her, was the one who was also interpreting the questions, we probably never would have gotten that information. So, so your agency should have somebody who speaks the language, if it's a second language, or can otherwise interpret, so that it can be done in private. The Domestic Violence Consensus Panel, which was a group of people put together in the 1990s by SAMHSA to come up with best practices for domestic violence and screening domestic violence, recommends this phrase before you start asking questions related to domestic violence or intimate partner violence. In most homes where there is substance abuse, families have other problems too. I'm going to ask some questions to see whether any of these things may have happened to you or your family. That is a very important phrase. And for those of you that are listening to this training who are in my family counseling class, you might see that phrase somewhere else before the semester ends. So you might want to study that phrase very carefully. So let's talk about that phrase. So the idea in using that phrase is you want to normalize it first by saying, in some families where there's substance abuse, the families have other problems too. What you're doing is trying to normalize it as these things happen, this thing is common, in an attempt to bring down the person's defenses. And then you're going to prepare them that you're about to ask them questions related to that. And this is an example of trauma-informed care where you never want to catch people by surprise by starting to ask them questions that may relate to a trauma that they experience. And so the order of these two sentences is really important. Hey, some families who have substance abuse have other problems too. I'm going to ask you some questions related to this to see if it's happened to you or your family. It's designed to bring down defenses and get truthful responses. The consensus panel also recommends 4 initial screening questions before you get into any other questions. And the order here was important too. Do you feel safe at home? So it's a big, broad question. Essentially, you're casting a broad net to see if there's anything happening in the home that may make the person feel unsafe. Has anyone in your family ever physically hurt you? Most people have been found to be more readily able to talk about physical harm or physical abuse than other types of abuse. That third question, has anyone in your family made you do sexual things that you did not want to do? Note, that question does not say, has anyone in your family sexually abused you or sexually violated you? Many times people who are victims of rape, when the husband or intimate partner is the rapist, has lots of confusing thoughts about that. Was that rape? I don't know. I mean, we're married. Is that even possible? It is absolutely a form of sexual violence. If you did not consent to sexual contact and you were forced into sexual contact or sexual intercourse, that is considered rape and sexual violence. But this question here is, has anyone in your family made you do sexual things you did not want to do? It's a broader, perhaps more gentler way of asking so that you can get down to what the truth of the matter is. And then, have you ever hurt anyone in your family physically or sexually. So this question also is asked a little bit later, as hopefully you've been able to work through and build rapport with the clients. Okay. So when you are asking questions related to intimate partner violence, you want to use very concrete examples instead of vague questions. So in a very direct, matter-of-fact way, when your husband comes home after drinking, does he ever hit or slap or push you or call your names, make fun of you, or otherwise hurt you? You know, versus, so is everything okay at home? So when you ask a question like, is everything okay at home? It is not direct. The person doesn't know what it is that you're actually asking them. It becomes very easy not to answer that question or give a vague answer in response. And on top of that, it may communicate that you are the one who is uncomfortable with asking these questions. So you want to ask questions in a very direct, concrete way. Also to potential perpetrators, asking concrete questions. So like, you know, if they say something like, you know, no, I mean, I lose my temper sometimes. Okay, so I mean, what exactly happens when you lose your temper? Well, if I lose my temper, you know, like, I mean, sometimes, you know, I don't know. I mean, I might hit him. So when you hit him, what does that mean? Is it a slap or is it a punch? So again, you want to be very concrete to get the answers. Now, many times perpetrators will automatically deny that there's any possibility for intimate partner violence. It's kind of a built-in defense mechanism. So one way to determine whether intimate partner violence might be present, which again is our goal with the screening, we're just trying to determine if it might be present. You can sometimes accomplish this by asking if the person thinks violence against a partner is justified in some situations. So like one example might be like, okay, well, so I know you don't do this, you're saying you don't do this in your relationship, but I mean, if a person found out their spouse was cheating on them behind their back, do you think it would be okay to hit them to stop it from happening? And based on how the person responds, you know, you make it an indication that thinks that they would be appropriate. They think this would be appropriate, which could be an indication again that there might be violence in the relationship. All right, so we're going to take a little sidebar and address children and adolescents in home with domestic violence. So again, remember that 40% of children who experience childhood abuse also are experiencing domestic violence in the home. We have many, many people who are experiencing horrific sexual violence before the age of 18. Again, more than a quarter of male victims of completed rape were first raped when they were 10 years old or younger. About 42% of female victims of completed rape were raped before the age of 18 years, which is statutory rape. We'll talk more about that. So this is a common factor in domestic violence situations. So when you're doing a screening, then you want to try and determine if any children are potentially being harmed. And so note that if they have been harmed, this is a mandatory child welfare services or child protective services report. I'm not going to spend too much time on the mandated reporting components. For those of you in the Alcohol and Other Drug Studies program at San Diego City College, there's an entire class on law and ethics as it relates to being a drug and alcohol counselor, where they go much more into detail with this. But it is important that you understand that if children witnessed violence, or if they were in the house while violence or abuse was happening, then by legal definition, they were harmed, and that's a mandatory child welfare services report. So if you're doing a screening and the person says, yeah, sometimes things get a little out of hand when we're intoxicated, well, what do you mean by out of hand? Are you ever being physically violent with each other or abusive with each other? You know, yeah, I mean, the other day we threw some plates towards each other. I see. So you mentioned that you have children. Were the children in the house when this happened? Oh yeah, but they were upstairs. They were asleep. You know, they didn't know what was happening. The minute they tell you that they were in the house, by definition, they were harmed. And that's because, in spite of the fact that parents think that children not actually seeing it with their eyes means that they're not affected by it, the evidence shows us that they are definitely affected by it. So note that inquiries into potential child abuse should not occur until the client's been given notice of the limits of confidentiality, 42 CFR Part 2. So this is the mandated reporter requirement that basically says before you start screening someone, you need to let them know that if they say anything that suggests a child might be in danger, or they're in danger of harming themselves, harming somebody else, or an elder's being harmed, that you are required by law to report that. In any treatment facility, this should already have been told to the client, but you want to make sure it was done before you do any screenings. All right. So let's also talk about statutory rape. And again, the statistics of how often people experience unwanted sexual contact or sexual violence before the age of 18. So statutory rape refers to sexual intercourse with a minor below the age of consent. And it's a common version of child abuse that may emerge while you're doing any kind of an intimate partner or domestic violence screening. So in the vast majority of cases, statutory rape will be in the past. If you're working with an adult in a treatment facility, obviously if they're talking about something that happened when they were under the age of 18, it would be in the past. Unless you're working with adolescents. There are some adolescent treatment programs out there, and if you're screening an adolescent, this may be something that happened recently or is currently happening. But one key question that you want to make sure that you find out is whether the perpetrator currently has access to children or minors. So if the person who was the perpetrator in statutory rape also has access to children now, even though it's 10 years later, that also is a mandatory child welfare services report. So we know that statutory rape, unfortunately, is very common in households with intimate partner violence or domestic violence, either in the family system, meaning that the rape is happening in the family system, or externally, meaning the person is experiencing domestic violence in the home, but they are also experiencing statutory rape or sexual contact with somebody outside of the household. So we know that children who witness abuse or who were sexually abused themselves tend to be sexually active much earlier than their peers, and people who have experienced sexual abuse are much more likely to be victims of statutory rape. We also know that in some homes where the perpetrator is sexually violent and abusive with adults in the house, they will also be sexually violent with adolescents, meaning, as an example, they're made single mom has a 16-year-old in the house. She's dating someone who is sexually abusing her, sexually violent with her, and that person is also abusing the 16-year-old. So it's very common, unfortunately, in domestic violence households. So we know that drug and alcohol use are often involved in the act of statutory rape. Many times perpetrators use alcohol in order to facilitate the rape. And we have lots of evidence that both the victims of statutory rape and the perpetrators are often intoxicated during the act. We also know that many survivors of statutory rape end up in substance use treatment facilities. There's a huge study that's done every couple of years, the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent and Adult Health, in that data set, we know that victims of statutory rape, 70% of them regularly use alcohol, 34% of them regularly use drugs. The question of why do you use comes up. Certainly experiencing domestic violence, statutory rape is a contributing factor. So it is not unusual that you have a client in your substance use treatment facility who is a survivor of statutory rape. So let's talk about mandated reporting requirements. When I do this lecture live, it often generates very lively discussion. So the law states that people below the age of consent cannot legally consent to having sex. And there is a specific penal code in the state of California that says statutory rape takes place when any person engages in sexual intercourse with a person under the age of 18. Now, we are not concerned about the 18-year-old senior and the 17-year-old senior who have been in a relationship with each other for a year and are going to prom and they're having sex with each other. Yes, by law, the person who is 17 years old is below the age of consent, but that's not what the point of teaching you this is all about. So statutory rape can be considered child abuse depending upon the circumstance. There's actually a chart out there that you can find online that says that, okay, well, if this person's this age and this person's this age, is it reportable? And it's a chart of which one's reportable and which one's not. Really, again, for our purposes, we simply need to evaluate the situations and circumstances. In many cases, it's obvious. Certainly, you know, the boyfriend, mom's boyfriend, committing statutory rape with a 17-year-old daughter, that's statutory rape. So we want to make sure that we address the things that are potentially abusive. And it is very important to remember that you can never get in trouble for contacting child welfare services to ask about whether you should report. You definitely can get in trouble when you were required to report and you did not. not. So when in doubt, you always report a statutory rape. Okay, a couple of other things about mandated reportable factors. So domestic violence or intimate partner violence is unfortunately not one of the exceptions to confidentiality as outlined by the Federal Code of Regulations. Clients can definitely self-disclose and report, but you cannot break client confidentiality to report domestic violence. SAMHSA does have some recommendations about this. So the statement is, although federal confidentiality regulations may prohibit reporting domestic violence to law enforcement authorities, you can still ask about it. Whether the treatment or whether the information is passed on along or not, it still bears on the treatment. Providers should acknowledge the abuse, help the client separate responsibility from that of the batterer, provide counseling, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea here is that even though it's not mandated reportable, does not mean that you can't address it. You can certainly address it clinically and supportively, and you can help the person contact law enforcement themselves if they so wish. So general guidelines to reporting violence in the home. If it involves children, you definitely report it. If the perpetrator is your client, so in other words, you're screening and going back to that study in the VA that somewhere between 20 and 30% of all people who are being treated for alcohol abuse admitted to abusing their spouse in the last year, then they're the perpetrator, but you cannot call law enforcement if somebody reports a crime while they're in treatment, unless that crime is on the premises or against staff. If somebody threatens future violence, that's a little different. So if it meets TerraSoft requirements, which again is something you learn in law and ethics, then that is reportable. All right, so let's keep moving on. So once you have screened for intimate partner violence and you see that there might be some indication that's happening, then that's going to require referral for further assessment. So with both victims and perpetrators, if possible intimate partner violence has been identified, then the client should be referred to some kind of an intimate partner violence or domestic violence intake program, or referred to another trained expert for further assessment. Now, your agency should have a relationship with somebody who's trained to do these further assessments. In some cases, you might have a licensed mental health clinician on staff who's been trained in DV assessment. Your agency might have a relationship with, Family Health Center or Community Health, Community Research Foundation, or the Justice Center, or some agency that does these kinds of domestic violence assessments. So whoever it is, your agency should have a relationship with one, and when you're out there working, you would want to talk to your supervisor about who this referral should go to. Now, note that it is a referral. It is not a mandate. So the goal is to help the client address the intimate partner violence, and you're likely going to have to sell them on the referral. So after you've done the screening, you've determined that there might be intimate partner violence. You want to convey to the victim that the partner's behavior is not okay, that this is not their fault, and the substance use is not an excuse. And then you want to see if you can get them to go talk with someone who's got more training for further assessment. So this is just an example phrase that you could use. I really appreciate your willingness to share and be open with me. I'm concerned about some of what you said to me because it suggests mistreatment or abuse. And I'd like for you to talk with someone who's trained in these kinds of relationship issues. Are you willing to meet with someone who could help provide you with more support, and maybe we can address these concerns? So that's a way to soft sell while still in a direct way to talk to somebody with more training. What you don't want to do is say like, well, I think there's domestic violence in your house. You should go talk to somebody who knows about these things. It's probably not going to get motivation for someone to do this. So again, we're going to encourage them to go talk with somebody who has further training to see if we can provide them with more support. These are some organizations here in San Diego that provide these kinds of domestic violence assessment. There are definitely many more than this, but this is just an example of some of the resources that are available. So what if they won't go? So let's say that you've asked if they'd be willing to talk to someone and they say, no, like, I'm not doing that. Then you continue to treat. So at this point, you're going to continue to build a relationship and rapport with the person, and you continue to encourage additional assessment. So I'm okay, you don't have to, but I'm really concerned about your safety. I'm concerned about the safety of your children. There is help available for you when you're ready. I'm here for you when you want to get help. I've had this experience before where somebody has said, no, I don't want to address this. And then later on in the treatment, something comes up where, they've gotten emotional or they're recognizing that, yes, this is a problem. And then you can bring it back up. I know originally you didn't want to do this, but would you be willing to talk with somebody who's got more training in this that could provide some support? So in other words, you hold that referral in your back pocket and you keep bringing it back out as appropriate. For both survivors and perpetrators, communications from within the treatment facility has to be carefully monitored to make sure that no additional violence ensues. Many domestic violence victims are really ambivalent about their perpetrators, and they may compromise their own safety without the assistance and support. Your agency should have some kind of policy related to this. What do we do when we know somebody is in an intimate partner or DV situation? Do we monitor their phone calls? Do we not allow the address of our facility to be disclosed? And there's many different ways that you can monitor communications. All right, let's talk about safety then. So, the basic format that we've talked about so far is intimate partner violence happens in substance use treatment facilities all the time. We have lots of clients that have experienced this. We are required to screen to determine if it might be there. If we get evidence that it might be there, then we're going to try and refer that person for further assessment. But what do we do about obviously unsafe situations? So if a client appears to be in immediate danger from a perpetrator, you have to address this first before any other issues, which includes you have to deal with that before you refer them for further assessment. And in some cases, you need to deal with the safety before you can even do substance use treatment. It's particularly important in outpatient treatment programs. So if the person is living at home and they're coming to your facility 3 times a week and you discover that they're in a violent situation in the home, their partner has threatened to kill them, there's a gun in the house, that would be an obvious case where we have to suspend drug treatment to address the safety issue and see if we can help the person ensure their safety first. So this is essentially how this breaks down then. So normally, right, you do the screening. Is there any evidence of possible intimate partner violence? If no, then you're done. If there is some evidence, now we're going to add this other dimension of asking, well, is the client currently safe? If the client's currently safe, for example, they're in an inpatient treatment program and their abuser is in prison for the next 10 years, then we move to refer them for additional assessment. But if we discover that there is intimate partner violence is possible and they're not safe, then we have to ensure the client's safety first before we do anything else. So when you're doing a safety screening, this is not the definitive list of questions, but these are some examples that you want to make sure that you ask. Are you currently feeling safe at home? Are you currently interacting with your partner? Has violence gotten worse? Are they using alcohol and drugs? Are they at home right now? Do you have somewhere safe to go? So you want to ask the questions to determine the level of safety. So if safety is an issue, the client may need to move to another location. So this could be a safe house with a family member or a friend where they can be protected. There are also some community-based, shelter-based safe houses here in San Diego. I'll give you a list of those. You also, though, may have a situation where the client's situation is concerning, but it's not high risk, meaning there's some psychological abuse, but no other indications of physical violence, or you might have a high-risk situation where the client's refusing to leave. And in that situation, you might want to consider developing a safety plan. So I've provided you with a safety plan template on Canvas. Let's go visit that. So same spot where the AMA screening questions were before. So in the files section, in the handouts folder, in the domestic violence screening, there is a file called Domestic Violence Safety Plan. This is also available in the appendix of the TIP 25. So a personalized safety plan, this is a long document, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but what you do is you work with the client. Let's see if I can zoom that so you can see it, to come up with a plan. So if I decide to leave, I will, and you get them to identify, well, how would you get out safety? Where would you go? You have to walk out the fire escape. I can keep my purse and my car keys ready and put them, in the kitchen in order to leave quickly. I can tell my sister about the violence and request they call the police if they hear suspicious noises. So what you do is you walk through and develop a plan. Now, that doesn't mean that the person is committed to following through with the plan. And you can often help sell them on the idea of doing this by encouraging them to work out a plan so that they at least know if they decided they were going to leave, what they can do in order to get out of there. So great document, really powerful experience. I've done safety plans with clients before who were ambivalent about leaving. And once they finished the safety plan, it actually gave them the confidence and the plan to know how to get out of that situation. All right. Okay, and these are some of the agencies in town. I haven't looked at this, checked these resources in probably over a year, but at least a year ago, these are agencies in town that had shelter-based domestic violence programs where people could be located in a safe house. All right, and then finally, the last section is including intimate partner violence or domestic violence on the treatment plan. So, as an alcohol and drug counselor, you are trained and expected to conduct intimate partner violence screenings, but without additional training, you're not expected or qualified to do extensive intimate partner violence assessment or intimate partner violence treatment. However, you are expected to be able to talk about intimate partner violence with care and concern, and you absolutely need to address how intimate partner violence and domestic violence contributes to why a person uses substances and or how it might be a relapse risk after they leave treatment. You can also include intimate partner violence treatment goals in any kind of a drug and alcohol treatment plan along with substance use disorder goals, meaning that you might have a bunch of goals related to the substance use, but you also have a goal in there that you're going to go to the domestic violence support group on Monday mornings at the Family Justice Center, once a week for the next 6 weeks. You can include strategies for ensuring safety on the treatment plan. You can identify high-risk situations. So, again, the idea is that we are definitely able to include it as part of substance use treatment. And again, the more extensive counseling is usually done as a supplement. Kind of in the same way that you can't prescribe medications to your clients, but if your client is suffering from bipolar disorder, you would want to include on the treatment plan, make an appointment with a psychiatrist, take medications as prescribed, in the same way that you might include take anger management classes, etc. When you're working with a perpetrator, it is very important that you do not directly or indirectly excuse them by allowing them to place blame for the battering or the violence on the alcohol and drugs. Meaning you don't want to write a goal saying stay sober so that I don't abuse my wife. Treatment for perpetrators requires first and foremost that they take responsibility for their triggers and behaviors. Substances don't commit violence, people commit violence. There's never been a bottle of vodka that walked down the street and jumped up and smashed itself over somebody's head. So if somebody's saying, well, I'm only doing this because of the alcohol, it's not the alcohol, it's you. And so we want to make sure that we don't excuse them. All right. So here's some general San Diego domestic violence, intimate partner violence resources. As always, if you have any questions about this presentation, feel free to contact me. Until next time.